Welcome. I'm Dr. Lisa Toppin, and you have joined Inputs to Action. I'm so excited today. I can hardly contain myself for the conversation we're about to have. So let me set the stage. Our guest today is Karen Gray Houston. She is an award-winning journalist, has spent many years covering all the DC. I was called the DC scene, the politics, the Capitol Hill, all of that. And now she adds to her titles author. We're going to talk about that. But the title I'm really excited about is Daughter of the Boycott. Karen, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Lisa.
I'm really excited. I mean, because we're in Black History Month, and what you shared through this discussion in Daughter of the Boycott is so important, and so it just gives us such a richness about our history. So I'm excited for the audience to get to have this inside conversation with you. So we're going to get in it. But to start, I want to just make sure that they know you. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you even get to journalism?
Oh, my goodness. Well, my uncle and my father, who I write about in this book, Daughter of the Boycott, Thomas Gray and Fred Gray, wanted me to be a lawyer. Hello. And somehow I just said, that is not my calling. That's for them. And I decided to go into journalism, thought I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. Ended up going into broadcast journalism at the encouragement of Fred Friendly, who was my advisor when I was at Columbia's journalism school. So here I am now, an author. I pinch myself. I can't believe I actually wrote a book. But just in a nutshell, my resume is first job, United Press International in Boston. I worked at a radio station, WHDH, in Boston as a reporter and anchor. I anchored on the ABC radio network out of New York. They had FM stations all over the country. I covered the Reagan White House for NBC News. I worked for WCBS TV as a writer, associate producer. I worked for WTOP All News Radio in Washington, D.C. And for almost 20 years, I worked for WTTG TV, Fox 5 in D.C. I think I didn't leave anything out. And here I am now, author.
Yes, here you are, author, and it's just, I mean, not a huge leap from that kind of career, but I'm curious as to what really inspired you to write the book and to sort of capture this role that your family played in the boycott.
Lisa, I had to write the book. Mm. My uncle Fred Gray, who's a renowned civil rights attorney, people now know about him. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the White House this summer. But he and my dad was an organizer of the boycott. But my father also wrote a book. My uncle wrote Bus Ride to Justice, and my father was working on a book. And, he always let us know what happened during that boycott was just such a seminal moment in the country's history that he wanted to write about his involvement. And he wrote he had some chapters, and he passed away before he could finish. And so it was as if I just said, well, I have to do it. I can claim this and make it my story and find out some things that I didn't know. And, some little known and untold stories that I stumbled upon in the course of the research, but it was as if I had to do it. And so I picked up the mantle and went with it. Yeah,
no, I'm glad you did. And I think the world is better that you did. And I love that you really did tell it from your experience, because you took us inside the first time you rode the bus when it wasn't segregated, probably long before you really understood the significance of that. Take us inside that a little bit. What was that like?
I was 4 years old when the boycott ended. When the boycott began, I was 4. It was only after the boycott was over that I had my first ride on a bus. My dad was a businessman. He co-owned a store where they sold radio and TV sets and appliances. And so he had his own car, And he was using that car to drive around and pick up Black passengers to keep them off the buses during the boycott. But our family didn't have to ride the bus because we had a car. And then when it was all over, because my parents were so involved in the fabric of what had happened during the boycott, one day my mom dressed me up and my two younger brothers, Thomas Jr. and Frederick, and she marched us about a block down the street to a bus stop. There was a bus did stop in our neighborhood. We lived in a little community called Mobile Heights. And when the bus came, we got on and she sat us down right up front behind the white bus driver. And she leaned over and she said, little Black children, she said, little Negro children, I want you to know what it's like not to have to ride in the back.
Wow.
So that was probably more powerful for her than it was for us, because we didn't really get it.
Yeah.
But that was my first encounter with a bus ride. And I mean, I can talk a little bit about the climate in Montgomery at the time to help people understand why Black folks were so outraged about and pressed into action because they needed to do something about the situation. Almost everything was segregated. I mean, Jim Crow laws kept Black people out of white restaurants and schools and churches and hotels. I mean, they even had water fountains that were set aside for the white people only. And so it was in that climate, and with most people having to ride buses because everybody didn't have a car back then. Right. Kind of like everybody didn't even have a telephone in their own home back then, back in the 50s. I mean, we're going back a ways.
Yeah.
And so they had to ride the buses, and they would get on the bus. You'd get on, you put your dime in the fare box, and the bus driver had police powers. And if they didn't want you to walk down the aisle past the white people who could sit in the front, they could tell you to get off the bus, go back to the side door, and get on and sit in the back. And that was back when if you'd been waiting for the bus, there was no covering over the bus. At the bus stop, there was no place to sit. And if it was raining and you had to go down to the back, sometimes the bus drivers would just drive off and leave you there. And so and then you got to wait for the next bus. You've got to pay more fare for the next one. You may be late for your job. People were just humiliated and offended at the way they were being treated. And so that's why there was so much action directed at let's stop this practice.
Right. And your uncle was really, I'm going to say at the center, really, I'm going to say plotting and planning with Rosa Parks around what that might look like at the point in which it was the right time to strike. Take us in a little bit around that piece of it, because I find that's fascinating.
My uncle, Fred Gray, who I still to this day call Uncle Teddy. So if I lapse into that, you know who I'm talking about. He had gone to law school in Cleveland, Ohio, because Black people could not attend law school in Montgomery, in Alabama. Black people just weren't allowed. So he'd gotten his degree, and he had this secret mission. I'm going to get my degree. I'm going to go down to Montgomery. I'm going to pass the bar. I'm going to start a law practice, and I'm going to destroy everything segregated I could find. Mm-hmm. And so that was his plan. So he had to, he joined the NAACP. Rosa Parks was the secretary and also the head of the youth council for the NAACP. And E.D. Nixon, who was the most prominent Black civil rights leader in Montgomery at the time, was the president of the NAACP. And so my uncle was exposed to those people, and E.D. was a mentor to him. And he and Rosa Parks were kindred spirits. They both hated segregation with a passion and were just determined to do something about it. So Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She was working at a department store that was down the street and around the corner from my uncle's new law office. He had just kind of fallen out of law school and was trying to drum up business. And so they would meet at lunchtime because she hated trying to eat at the department store where they didn't let Black people eat at the lunch counter. Mm-hmm. And they would talk about, well, what are we going to do? And she'd already had some bad experiences on a bus. And she, if next time I'm in that situation, what should I do? And my uncle said, well, you could act a certain way. And there had been a situation with some other women who had refused to give up their seats on the bus. And that didn't get them too far. So she felt, and she had the kind of demeanor, she was sort of demure and soft spoken and quiet, though an activist at heart. And she, they talked about, well, what should you do if they come over and, tell you to give up your seat? And she was, well, I could be calm and, relax and, politely, refuse to give up my seat. So there was that kind of conversation going on with the two of them.
Yeah, which I think is so telling. I think you think that it was, or you grow up believing that it was just an organic scenario, that it was on that day she just was so tired that that she refused to give up her seat, not really appreciate. That's why I think this work is so important. Not appreciating the fact that they've been talking about this. There was a plan in terms of how she was going to, when it would happen. We knew it would happen again, and how she was going to respond when it did. And so
she seized the opportunity.
Yeah.
That day.
Yeah, for sure. But you mentioned the other women, and we've recently been hearing about Claudette Colvin. I saw a story about her just recently, who was one of those early women that you referenced who didn't give up her seat. Say some more about her story.
Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old African-American girl, student in a high school, on a bus that day. This was March 2nd, 1955, so 9 months before the Rosa Parks situation. And a bunch of the students they got out of school early, and this was an important to note, March, right after Black History Month, or they were calling it Negro History Month then. So they'd been talking about the injustices against Black people and how things, Jim Crow laws were wrong. And all that was swirling around in her head when the bus got crowded and the driver looked around and said, I'm going to need one of those seats. And, some of the other students got up and moved, and Claudette was refused. She told the driver, I paid my fare. She was sitting in the colored section. It's my constitutional right, and so she just was determined to sit there. So the bus driver, Mr. I got police powers, called a police officer in, and the police officer, well, long story short, there were a couple of situations where the police got called. Eventually, they got on the bus and they knocked her books out of her lap and they picked her up and they dragged her out of the bus, kicking and screaming, and took her to an adult jail. Right. So she was charged with disorderly conduct and violating the segregation statute and assault against a police officer. So, my uncle thought, oh, this is a perfect case to challenge the segregation in Alabama. And however, that summer, and this was March, that summer, and they were starting to raise money for her, defense and this and that and the other. That summer, she got pregnant. And other Black leaders, I think, felt that they didn't want the face of their challenge of segregation to be an unwed teenage mother.
Yeah.
And so that was it. I mean,
Yeah, it's just an important part of the story and the evolution, and how we get to 9 months later when Rosa does hold on to her seat and things really began. So take us now into the
can I interrupt you right there? Because there were those other women that we forgot to mention, Susie McDonald and Aurelia Browder and Mary Louise Smith, 3 other women who in the months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat did the same thing, but they also were not chosen for various reasons that people discuss. Susie McDonald looked like a white woman, and she used to sit in the white section, And so after the bus drivers found out she wasn't really white, there were, fights about that, and she was arrested. Aurelia Browder and her sons will say that she didn't get chosen because Black officials, the leaders at the time, felt that she was too outspoken and too dark-skinned. Colorism sort of played a role in this. And Mary Louise Smith was a teenager. She was, I believe, 18. And the feeling was she wasn't the perfect candidate because they said her father was an alcoholic. The family said he wasn't. I don't know what the story was, but they wanted to pick the perfect person. And Rosa Parks just had the demeanor that they were looking for. she had the smarts. She was the person who was the one who was going to be deemed the mother of the civil rights movement, because she was just the right person at the right time.
Well, she didn't disappoint, because here we are, So there was something to their calculation. But I'm wondering, and some of that, in some of the calculation was sort of the planning that went on. So your father really was very involved now with I'll say, the organizing of the boycott. So we have the moment with Rosa, and now we're in a boycott. So take us inside that part of it, because your father was driving. There were people were doing all kinds of things.
Martin Luther King was drafted as the leader of the movement. He was a reluctant. He didn't go in there and say, "Hey, pick me. I want to be the spokesperson and the leader." When the first day of the boycott, they had a lot of meetings, and the ministers were the ones who were really involved in what are we going to do now. Joanne Robinson, who was an English professor at Alabama State University, headed up a group called the Women's Political Council. They were involved. She had threatened. She'd been meeting her group with city officials and officials from the bus company, looking for better treatment of Black people before this all blew up, and wasn't getting it. And eventually brought in Martin Luther King and Fred Gray and others into these meetings with the officials. E.D. Nixon was looking around. There had been other bus boycotts in cities outside of Montgomery, Mobile, Alabama, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but they weren't very successful. They didn't accomplish a lot, but Edie was looking at those situations going, we could do that in Montgomery. So there were other people doing that. And then once it became clear that after that first day, when all the Black people stayed off the buses, they said, oh, we got to go on from here. They created an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And that group coordinated all the day-to-day activities of the boycott. And my dad was on the founding board of that organization. Then they decided, what they were going to do. And we're going to have some cars and have people picking up passengers to keep them off, and get the taxi drivers to join in on this, and maybe get some cars from funeral homes. They've got cars. Mm-hmm. And so it started out like that, and it kind of steamrolled when it became obvious that the people in Montgomery were excited at the prospect of some sort of success, and that they stayed off the buses for 382 days.
Yeah, it's incredible, particularly in the context of the lack of ease to get where you needed to go, and the need for jobs. It's not like you had a lot of options, and so that was real commitment to make that happen. It was, yeah.
And some of the white women who wanted their maids to come and clean up their houses and cook would go pick them up, yeah. And take them to work. And I think the mayor told them to stop. So there, it was an interesting and very unusual time.
Yeah. No, really. I mean, again, the book is over your shoulder, listeners. So do look for that, and it's just there's so much detail and just so many stories that it's going to be hard to capture them all. When you think about all of the research that you've done and all of the stories that you capture, is there one that stands out in your mind that is just an important one to bring forward?
Well, Lisa, I will say probably the story about Hilliard Brooks is forefront in my mind. Hilliard Brooks was a Black man, a young man who had, he was actually a friend of my dad's. They played street football together when they were kids, and they both had served in World War II in the Navy. But Hilliard Brooks was trying to get a ride one day on a bus in downtown Montgomery, and was shot and killed by a white police officer. So there's a lot that goes into the story, but I do think it helped set the stage for the boycott. And this was in 1950, so 5 years before the boycott. Hilliard was trying to get on the bus and said something. There's a lot of controversy about exactly how it happened. Did he say something that upset the bus driver or somebody on the bus? And the bus driver, white bus driver, summons the police. Police officer comes over and according to one account, okay, pushes Hilliard to the ground when he gets there. He's off the bus by then, pushes him to the ground. And when Hilliard tries to get back up, the police officer pulls out his gun and shoots him. And Hilliard later dies in the hospital. Some bystanders got shot, were affected by this as well. But my dad found out about it and was outraged. Dad was teaching at a Catholic school that had an AMVETS, American Veterans Association, that was training veterans. And Dad was teaching, and Hilliard was taking some classes there. Wow. So Dad and the commander of this AMVETS unit found out and said, hey, we can't let those guys get away with that. And the commander, Ronald Young, and my dad wrote a letter to city officials, to the mayor and the police commissioner, and said, you guys should prosecute that guy to the fullest extent of the law. A police review board said it was, a justifiable shooting. Have we heard that before? Mm-hmm. And nothing happened. So Dad and Ronald Young organized a huge protest, a veterans protest in downtown Montgomery. And they had the guys carry the signs that said, ballots will beat bullets. Mm-hmm. And at a time when very few Black people were registered to vote, they said, okay, we're going to go down here. You're going to go into those of you who haven't registered to vote, go into the courthouse where you could register at the time and register to vote. And so a whole lot of Black people registered to vote. There was some newspaper article, at least one newspaper article at the time, didn't mention the protests, just kind of said, hey, what's up with the fact that all these Black people registered to vote that day? Just acknowledging that Black people had registered, but it didn't change anything. But I think a lot of people remembered when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. And on top of that, all of the horrible ways that they were being treated every day on the buses, all of that set the stage for helping to make that boycott successful.
Yeah, well, and I love the strategy of that, because it wasn't just to protest, but it was also to register to vote, which we know and appreciate that, ballots do challenge bullets for sure. And so I just think that they really give us a strong blueprint of how do you take on injustice. And it was just so well organized. I'm telling you, you got to get this book. Because the way you tell the stories, you really sort of take us inside what happened. You tell one story about your father being arrested, which just surprised me so much because of the time that it was in terms of Jim Crow and how the arrest took place. Take us into that story.
I think that none of the activists and the organizers were surprised that any of them would ever get arrested. But there was a roundup in February. The boycott started in December of 55, and in 56 February, the police started rounding these guys up. And one day they arrested, well, the arrest took place over several days, but they started arresting people, and eventually 89 of the activists, or people who were in any way actively involved in the boycott, in the leadership of the boycott, were arrested. My dad was working that day, and he owned. They would repair the radios and TVs as well. Back then, sometimes if your TV set broke down, you needed to call somebody. You call, you bought it, and so he and a guy that he co-owned the store with was an electrician who knew a lot about whatever. And so my dad learned some things and was out in our neighborhood working on somebody's set or something. And he came home, and my mom said, oh, the sheriff's department was just here. They were looking for you. And apparently the two guys were sitting in a cruiser out in front of the house. And one of the officers came toward my dad and said, well, we have a warrant to arrest Thomas Gray. And he said, I'm Thomas Gray. And they said, he said, well, what am I being arrested for? Some kind of violation of the boycott statute. So my dad said, okay. So, the guy was taking him to the car. My dad said, well, I have my, the car from my shop. Can I take the car back to the shop because they're going to need it? And it was very civilized. The police said, okay. They followed him back to his shop, and he dropped off the car and got into the back of the cruiser. They didn't handcuff him or anything. And they were driving to the jail, and they stopped. They saw the minister at Holt Street Baptist Church, where they had that first big mass meeting where King was kind of inducted as chosen as the leader. And the minister, no, they didn't stop at the church. They stopped at his house. And his wife came to the door and said, oh, no, the minister's on his way to church. You have to catch him at the church. And so they went to the church, and the minister said, well, I have some business to conduct here at the church first. Can I just come turn myself in? And they said, sure. So it was all very surprisingly civilized.
Yeah.
And then that gets to the jail. And there's all these people out front because they've rounded up, Ralph Abernathy's out front and some other people. And they're going in. They've set up a guy who's going to bail people out. One of the local businessmen was, as soon as you got arrested and fingerprinted and all that, he would put up the money for post the bond, and the people went away. But everybody was so excited about it. It was like, oh, God, my dad wore that arrest like a badge of honor for the rest of his life. Yeah. They rounded us up and arrested us. And then what happened? There was a trial. And a lot of people don't know this. There was a trial, but they didn't want to put all those 89 people on trial at the same time because it was just going to be in a courthouse crazy. So they only put Martin Luther King on trial. And he was convicted and fined $500. And my uncle represented him, of course, and appealed the case, which was eventually dismissed. But anyway, my uncle's written a book about that, Alabama v. King, which came out last year. There are a lot of little known stories about this boycott.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that is, I mean, you just gave me another one. There's so many stories in this book. I think that's why I'm just so excited about it. And I think it like I said, we just get it. We get an inside look at the history that is so much a part of our experience. Nobody went through Black History Month and didn't learn about Rosa Parks and didn't learn about the bus boycott. But this is a new level of learning, I promise you. Karen, I'm interested in your thoughts around what do we do now to fight repression? And it's as I've said, your family, the movement gave us such a blueprint for how they planned, how they organized, how they came together. We've made some progress, so here we are. But things are happening. There's book banning. There are all kinds of things going on. What is your take on what we do? How do we respond?
Well, Lisa, I think we've got to do what they did. You've got to stand up and fight. You can't ignore it. And you mentioned book banning. I mean, here you have people who are objecting to books, and largely a lot of the book banning is directed at African-American books. I mean, you can look at the, was it Florida? Ron DeSantis and his administration down there, and they're banning an African-American history class. A lot of the books that are being targeted are books are by and about people of color. Some of them are about sexual preference, but I think what parents and other people ought to do is go to those school boards and stand up and say, we're not going to let you whitewash our history like this. Right. And how dare you say that our history has no value? Right. And I think you have to stand up and fight that and don't let that continue.
Yeah, it's so important because I think we have finally gotten to a place where we recognize representation matters, but also history matters. Like you've got to see yourself represented in a real way in terms of the history that you're engaging. And we've got rich history that should be counted and included, and it's a shared history. It's the history of this country. It's not just the history of Black people. It's the history of all of us who call this home. So I'm with you in terms of standing up, and I'm hoping that it's a larger collective that really joins in on that.
Yeah, history is important. I mean, you have to understand that the aim of it is to broaden our understanding of the world. And I want to be hopeful. I want to be like Martin Luther King, who said famously, the long arc of the moral universe is aimed at justice. It bends towards justice, I think is the phrase. So
Yeah.
I want to think that that's the direction we're ultimately headed in, and I want to be hopefully, but I don't know where we are now.
Yeah, well, like you, I'm hopeful for the future, and I'm hoping that that folks will pick up the mantle and do as you're suggesting to stand up and to push back on this.